Our currency is crashing and will soon no longer be the world standard, which will be our greatest defeat, frankly, in 200 years.
Hey, so a lot of people have been asking me about the end of the US dollar and what should you do about it? Should you be worried that your net worth and your retirement is basically going to evaporate? And how could you prevent the loss of the strength of the US dollar? And people keep asking me this because even though this video isn't personalized financial advice for you, I am a financial advisor, I'm licensed, I run an actively managed ETF, I'm a licensed real estate broker, and I run a real estate startup. So I'd like to add my perspective. So the useful way to understand all of this is why the attacks on the US dollar are really starting. They're starting out of two frustrations. One, gas and oil prices rising. For example, why is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, or sometimes called OPEC Plus when we add in other countries, why are these groups of countries essentially contributing to rising oil prices? And what does that have to do with the dollar? Well, basically, exporters of oil in those countries want to make more money per barrel of oil. So they get together and say, hey, why don't we just reduce production and then prices will go up and people will speculate that oil will go up. And when the price of oil goes up, people can generally in America point the finger at the easiest person in the world to point the finger at. And that's the President of the United States. The President of the United States is a Democrat. And Republicans are not happy with the work that the Democratic President Joe Biden is doing. In fact, they haven't been happy since the day he was elected. They certainly weren't happy when we withdrew from Afghanistan, and they certainly weren't happy when on the day Joe Biden took office, he ended up withdrawing from the Keystone XL pipeline extension, which would have delivered a larger supply of oil from Canada to the United States. That was the expansion line that was canceled. The permits were revoked by the Biden administration. So Republicans like to make the argument that Joe Biden is contributing to oil prices going up, conveniently at the same time as OPEC is leading oil prices to go up, but it's easier to blame Joe Biden. It is also easier to blame the Afghanistan withdrawal and a weakening of the United States military strength. Now keep in mind, this video isn't designed to be partisan. It's not to say you should or shouldn't like Joe Biden, and it's also not to defend him. Of course, a lot of responsibility is on the shoulder of Joe Biden when it comes to actions him and his administration take. The point here is just to give you a quick background. See, Republicans now are arguing that Joe Biden's military in the Middle East has weakened so much that we're actually creating a power vacuum in the Middle East. When we botched our withdrawal of leaving Afghanistan, where on one hand Joe Biden says there will not be helicopter evacuations in Kabul, or Afghanistan. And then what exactly do we have? Helicopter evacuation, a botched suicide bomb attack that ended up killing not only dozens of Afghan individuals, but also U.S. service members, maiming others from the U.S. military, and a botched CIA operation to actually take out the potential bombers, but accidentally instead killing a dad and some of his children in their front yard in a completely botched American CIA intervention. Yeah, these things haven't given Joe Biden the best reputation for military strength in the Middle East. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because a country called Saudi Arabia feels less defended and feels like they can't rely on the United States as much as they used to be able to. Back in the early 70s, President Nixon actually partnered with Saudi Arabia and said, hey, look, you sell us oil and we'll price it in US dollars and we'll promise to protect your oil fields. And today, we actually help confiscate weapons that Iran delivers to Houthi rebels who attack Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. Now, just to make it clear how much our standing with Saudi Arabia has shifted, Iran has recently agreed to attack less, and that is support the Houthis less with weapons if, and we're talking thousands of Kalashnikov AKs and hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition, Iran has agreed to supply the Houthis less who attack Saudi Arabia, because Iran and Saudi Arabia are now trying to form an alliance so they can get along with each other, because Saudi Arabia feels they have to take their own security into their own hands because the power player that used to be there, America, in the Middle East, is no longer. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because Saudi Arabia has been trading oil to us in dollars, and they've been trading oil with other countries in dollars as well. But now that Saudi Arabia feels like they can't rely on the United States as much because of botched operations in the Middle East, an anti-oil government, which is basically an anti-Saudi Arabia government via the Biden administration, and the fact that over 70 attacks on the U.S. military in the Middle East have only been responded to via or with U.S. military action 3 times. That is less than a 4.5% response rate to military attacks on Americans or American contractors. Think about that. When America gets attacked in the Middle East now, under the Biden administration, it responds less than 4.5% of the time. So sure, while the United States under Nixon used to help protect Saudi Arabian oil fields in exchange for using the US dollar, a system which then became known as the petrodollar system. That's a complicated but fancy way to basically say oil that's traded in US dollars, petrodollars. But don't get confused by the petrodollar, just think about the US dollar. The more countries use the US dollars, the more they're actually interested in holding our debt, like United States treasuries. The more they're willing to hold our United States debt because it gives them easy access to US dollars, the easier it is for us to fund our deficit. Well, guess what? Another thing people are very upset about Joe Biden with: the debt going up and the deficit. So what you can see is a very coordinated attack against the Joe Biden administration. Rightful or not, that's what's happening. You have the Biden administration who's blamed for essentially higher oil prices via the Keystone, higher oil prices via the lack of our work with countries we used to strongly or more strongly ally with, like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, who now feel like they can't trust us as much because we don't respond to military events. And when we do conduct military operations like that CIA operation or the botched evacuation of Kabul, we fail, which is an embarrassment to our military. Then what happens? Countries in the Middle East are less interested in being reliant on the United States. So what did Saudi Arabia just do? They just decided, you know what? We're going to sell oil to China and natural gas to China denominated in yuan. That is the Chinese currency rather than the US dollar. That puts less demand on the US dollar, which means we have less ability to basically print money to fund our deficits, our debts in the country. And there's less demand for our treasuries, which is just a form of debt, which means potentially we run into a situation where we have to pay higher interest rates just to fund our government. So simply, look how all of this comes together. Keystone Pipeline, botched military operations, a lower usage of the US dollar, meaning higher interest rates. And all of this together for the average American means higher energy prices, higher interest rates, more expensive for you to fill your tank of gas, for you to pay your heating bill and your electricity bill, and more expensive for you to pay off your debts, whether it's a mortgage on a home, a loan on a car, student loans, or credit card debt. Everything gets more expensive for you because of the United States' standing in the world. Now again, whether or not Joe Biden is solely responsible for this doesn't matter. What matters now is that it's very easy for the entire media to attack a sitting president because it gets views and it gets attention, and there's probably a good amount of truth to what's being said. Although you can't trust everything you hear in the media, just like you shouldn't trust everything you hear on the internet. But think about this. when we just passed, during a time of rampant inflation, an $80 billion CHIPS Act, which is basically a giant stimulus check paying for American factories for chips, we are essentially creating inflation by providing stimulus checks to businesses in America. Now, on one hand, that's good because then we can have advanced manufacturing in America and we can create American jobs. But it's really no different than sending a large stimulus check to a big business and a big corporation rather than sending stimulus checks to individuals. The same is true for the over $360 billion Inflation Reduction Act spending. There are two parts. There's the let's hire 80,000 new IRS agents to tax Americans more, and then let's also spend, and then that's supposed to help reduce some of the expenses of this plan by over $700 billion. But then we also have expenses of about $389 billion for energy credits for electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels and wind and hydrogen. Goldman Sachs believes those expenditures aren't going to cost $389 billion. They're actually going to be 3 times as expensive, which basically creates more inflation yet again. So once again, string together what's happening and ask yourself, dang, why is the dollar being talked about as losing value? Well, in an inflationary time, we limited our ability to supply our own oil. We're not taking care of our military in the Middle East. We're not taking care of our allies as much as we should in the Middle East. We are printing money to help finance the war in Ukraine at the same time as we're sending massive stimulus checks, likely worth over $1 trillion, to American corporations who lobbied for it. Again, this is not at all designed to be an attack on a political party. It's simply a breakdown of why is everybody talking about the loss of value or the decline of value of the US dollar. Well, maybe it's the political items that I just outlined, or it's the fact that no currency in the world, in the history of the world, has ever survived going to zero. That's right. Every single currency that has ever existed has gone to zero throughout the thousands of years of human history that we know of. Since after all, we didn't really start recording history until tombs were inscribed in the era of ancient Egypt. But since then, every currency that has ever existed has gone to zero. So when people suggest, oh my gosh, the dollar has lost over 90% of its value since the early 1900s, yep, that's going to continue to happen. Politics might make it worse. But you know what else is worth keeping in mind? It might not matter to you. Why not? Because in my opinion, the way every single person watching this video should protect themselves is by making sure that they invest in hard assets. Hard assets are things like real estate, or frankly, even stocks like shares of companies. Now, usually we don't think of shares of companies as hard assets because we think of it as a piece of paper, but really that's just a share of a percentage of ownership in a real business. Just like the deed to your car, the title to your car, or the deed to your real estate is just a piece of paper that evidences your ownership in a real asset. Generally, in my opinion, the best thing to do is make sure that when you have excess capital, you invest it into financial assets. The reason for that is, even though right now we denominate real estate in dollars, like, oh, a house is $400,000. Or if you're in California, a fixer-upper is $1 million. Or, oh, a share of Tesla stock is $200. Even though we denominate those assets in dollars, if in the future the dollar were to vanish and disappear, the shares of ownership of those companies that provide value and that real estate would still have value. Now, you might be paid in a different form of currency, like maybe it's Bitcoin or Ethereum, or it's the Chinese yuan, or it's the euro. Who knows? But it doesn't matter. If your wealth is in assets like stocks and real estate and not in actual cash, then it doesn't matter what the underlying currency is. You're going to end up trading your time for a currency of whatever it is via your job. Maybe it's a different currency. And your wealth should be protected by assets that are really currency agnostic, like businesses or real estate. Now, this is, of course, where some people will pitch hard assets like gold as well, or silver. And those are options as well. In fact, remember, this video is not to give you personalized financial advice. It's just to say that really the medium of exchange we use today Even if the dollar is losing its value in the international community and the United States is losing respect, its military is losing respect, and its international standing is weakening, the fact of the matter is today, the United States is still the strongest economy in the world. And I would never bet against American companies and American properties, real estate. So in my opinion, I love America so much that it doesn't even matter to me if the dollar goes to zero, because I'll invest in what has always made America great. And that is American land and American companies. And that, in my opinion, is how you can hedge yourself from the dollar. Now, one final note. Some people have asked me, Kevin, what about the Eurodollar? Okay, I'll make a brief note on this, but I have to say, if you want more perspectives on building your wealth, do check out the programs linked down below on building your wealth. Even though, again, I'm a licensed financial advisor, I've got these courses on building your wealth linked down below, like real estate investing courses, very similar to what we do in my real estate startup. It's like the blueprint for you, how to become a millionaire in real estate, how to build wealth investing in stocks, how to build a business as an entrepreneur, or even get a raise as an employee in the Elite Hustlers group. Check out those programs linked down below. You find a coupon code expiring. We do change the price over time. Price generally goes up, and that way you get lifetime access locked in at a lower price. And that's a benefit to all existing members. So check out those programs linked down below. But on the topic of the Eurodollar, let's keep this short. The Eurodollar is something that really confuses a lot of people. The Eurodollar is actually much more important than the petrodollar. See, the petrodollar amounted to trade of around $4 trillion in 2021. The Eurodollar amounted to trade worth about 3 times as much in 2021. Now that's actually really important because it shows even if we lost the petrodollar, that is the oil traded dollar, foreign countries still use the American dollar a lot. But what is the Eurodollar? Well, the Eurodollar is basically just any time a foreign country holds the US dollar. It's a fancy way of just saying US dollars that are elsewhere, whether they're in Africa or in China or an embassy in California or at a consulate in Germany. It doesn't really matter. Any dollars that are traded anywhere around the world that aren't used for oil and aren't by Americans in America are considered Eurodollars. Not to be confused with the euro at all. The reason I bring that up is because the petrodollar, again, is 1/3 the size of that. So even if in 30 years the petrodollar disappeared, as long as we're the biggest and strongest economy, or still one of the biggest and strongest economies, that Eurodollar is going to keep America great. Now do also remember, in 20 or 30 years, the odds are oil is just not going to be that important anymore. So should we really be worried about the weakening of the dollar? Not so much, because we should be hedging ourselves with real assets anyway. Should we be worried about the weakening of America's standard and America's economy and American politics? Absolutely. And that's why the best thing to do is subscribe to the channel here on YouTube and learn everything that I could share with you on not just finance, but also politics, productivity, and tech. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.